So Illinois faces some very harsh fiscal realities. As Chris has already alluded, we have a structural deficit. It's dogged us for many years. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not a product of the recession, even though the recession exacerbated things and made it very evident, obviously very clear that we have a problem. But Illinois for a very long time has had a large and growing gap between our sustainable revenues and projected spending levels. And sustainable revenues, we're not in the Fiscal Futures Project, I can tell you, including borrowed funds or borrowing as not counting that as income. So we have that, a structural deficit with the deficits that we hear in the press annually that are persistent, but we also, on top of all that, have the largest in the nation unfunded pension liability. Now, Dick Dye from the Fiscal Futures Project did a presentation the other day for us and talked about $100 billion as being that unfunded pension liability. But he also made it clear that that's probably a very conservative estimate, that it's actually probably much higher. But it's worst in the nation. That's what we need to know. We have a harsh fiscal situation and a tough economic climate. So we have some painful choices. It comes down to politics. Politics is deciding who gets what, when, and how. And in this kind of environment, it makes it very challenging. So what can policymakers, what can our legislators, what can the governor do to reduce Illinois' structural deficit? Can they bend the cost curve, and what is that? And we'll talk about that. I would just say up front here, the Illinois policymakers are faced again, they were this year and they will for years to come, with many tough budget choices because of the structural deficit. So can one thing solve it? Can they just simply cut their way out of it? No. Can they spend their way out of it? No. It's going to have to be a combination of things. So should they cut spending, and how much, and what spending should be targeted? Should they cut across the board? Will the spending cuts be immediate or phased in? What taxes, if they're going to raise taxes, what should they raise? Should they extend the income tax increase? Or should they broaden the tax base? Should they tax services? It's the fastest growing sector of the economy compared to the manufacturing or the goods part of the economy. Or tax retirement income, which always sends up shivers of every legislator's spine when you raise that one. So there's backlash. There's the political problem. The fact of the matter is, this is a political situation as well as an economic and fiscal one. What is the political situation? Well, every 2 years, state representatives, every 4 years, state senators have a job interview with the electorate. They're put up for election. They're concerned about being reelected, and that's a real issue. So plans to cut current benefit programs create strong and immediate backlash from recipients and other interested groups. So these are people that are involved in the elective process, and therefore legislators and the governors pay very close attention to the reaction within the citizenry and the taxpayers. So beneficiaries count on state expenditure programs, and they think, from their perspective, that if we change things now, we're changing the rules in the middle of the game. So it's really, for many people who legitimately depend on state programs for their well-being and perhaps even for their very lives, fairness is an issue. Fairness may require giving beneficiaries of state programs enough time to adjust to reduction or elimination of state services. So that's an issue as well. So the question is, can policymakers, can our legislators and the governor reduce the structural deficit by bending the growth of state expenditures, by bending that curve? It's had an upward trajectory. It's growing faster than our revenues, thus creating the structural deficit. Can we bend that curve downward to improve upon that imbalance so that the expenditures do not grow as fast as currently projected? The short answer, as you can see, is yes. At least that's our belief. Even without actually cutting state spending, Illinois policymakers can reduce the budget deficit by slower growth in future spending. So when we talk about bending the cost curve, we're looking at future projections of government expenditures, and can we slow that down? So bending the curve, it focuses, as I said, on future or projected costs. Illinois policymakers have already started this work. They've adopted austerity measures that we know about in the past, the previous session, not this spring, but the previous spring. They adopted austerity measures, and earlier before that, the past 2 to 3 years. So effective January 1, 2011, Illinois policymakers enacted a temporary increase in the personal and corporate income tax rates. And now I realize we're talking about expenditures today, not revenues, but it's all part of the structural deficit. And they capped, and this is where you start bending the curve, they capped the growth of general funds spending. So that's in there as well. So it's a 2% cap on the future spending, 2% per year from 2012 to 2015. So that was a part of that plan that was adopted a couple of years ago. Now that phases out, the income tax increase phases out January 1, 2015. Now in the Medicaid program, again, it's a package. It's revenues and cuts and efficiencies. The revenue was increased in the effort to save the Medicaid program that was approved June 14, 2012. It increased the cigarette tax. It raised about $675 million, at least that's what it was projected. I'm not sure exactly what the numbers have actually proven, but that was the plan in the new revenues for Medicaid. In addition to that, cuts were enacted to the benefits, which is very difficult to sell to the legislature and to the governor, but through negotiations they did do this, they did take these steps, and they also included efficiencies within this package that would save about $1.6 billion in fiscal year 2013. Now, so that's an example of a package that bends the curve and helps to raise or increase the, make the budget less imbalanced, to, in other words, ameliorate the cost or the expenditures as they increase from year to year. In addition, and I know Nancy Hudspeth will talk about this in more detail, but they also have adopted reforms to the budget process that could result in future cost savings, in the sense that if you have better information, if there's more transparency and accountability, clarity in the timetable for the budget process, we like to think that then legislators and the governor can make better decisions fiscally. So what more can Illinois do to bend the curve toward balancing the budget? The Fiscal Futures Project researchers have recommended options that legislators and the governor attempt to bend the curve by making the package to save Medicaid that I just described, making those adjustments permanent, so as to slow the cost of the program, and they need to adopt policies to increase the revenue that coincide with projected increases in the Medicaid program, and also as we look ahead to the phase-in of the ACA, or what's popularly been called Obamacare. So we also, that's just one example, but we need to identify costly inefficiencies in state government programs, how we deliver them. We need to do it more effectively and efficiently, and we need to correct these programs by legislative action. We need also to adopt more reforms to the budget process itself. So what did the governor and the General Assembly do for the new fiscal year, for fiscal year 2015? On May 30th, the governor and the General Assembly adopted a deficit budget and put off the tough decisions that we've been kind of talking about, and we'll talk about more, to balance the budget. So there was no bending the curve this year. The new budget did not extend income tax rates that will begin phasing out January 1, 2015, and it did not cut spending, which means there will not be enough revenue to pay for the operating expenses. Thus, the new budget for fiscal year 2015, which went into effect July 1st, the new budget authorizes borrowing from next year's budget and shifting revenue from last year's budget to pay for this year's operating expenses. Consequences: just a couple days after that was adopted, on July 3rd, The Illinois Supreme Court signaled that it will likely declare recently enacted pension reforms as unconstitutional. Therefore, the concept of kicking the can down the road just got more costly in the long term in the face of having to redo pension reform. Therefore, I would submit that the pressure for a more comprehensive solution to the state budget imbalance and pensions will be and should be very intense in the years to come.